Metal's very personal to me. I'm a huge fan. I have been since I was like 11 years old. So I feel like this show, in many ways, like I've been preparing my whole life, to do it in a lot of ways. But yeah, so for me, we had a lot of success with our other show, Dark Side of the Ring, which is on Vice and that also on Hulu as well too, which is about sort of the real stories behind the very colorful and crazy world of professional wrestling. And this the world of metal was kind of always the next logical step for us in terms of where we wanted to go, like this other world to explore, as it was our other childhood favorite passion. And I mean me and my creative partner Jason Eisner. And yeah, it was just sort of about like looking at metal as something that is so ubiquitous, still very popular today, but also a genre that I feel like is so largely misunderstood and often misrepresented, in many ways. I mean, historically, you mentioned back in the 80s, metal was something that had a target on its head. It was something that was a lightning rod of controversy. It was something that was often weaponized and sort of commodified by other groups, to sort of show the evils and of metal, but also to further their moral crusades at the time. There was also in the late 80s, early 90s, there was a lot of censorship and free speech issues going on in terms of all the different, all these different congressional hearings that were going on to try and, censor music and things like that. So like metal always had a target on it, from that point of view, but also in media. Other times when you hear these stories or when they've been told, or stories like this in the past, they're always kind of told through this lens of like, a very sort of like expose into sex, drugs, and rock and roll. And it's this kind of looking at rock stars, like they're aliens from another planet, in a way. And so we wanted to strip away with all that stuff and try to find ways to tell these stories that other people can relate to on a very basic human grounded level, like stories of grief and stories of tragedy, or stories of perseverance and defiance and things like that. And just to kind of show that well, maybe you think that they're these larger than life rock stars who lead these unrelatable crazy lives, but really we can see when you strip all that away and you're able to kind of approach these stories in a much more grounded, respectful way, that there is a lot of ways to relate and there's common ground there. And that's kind of what we wanted to do. We wanted to make people understand this genre more, because I feel like it's often misunderstood. In sort of establishing what this series is going to be, we didn't want it to just be all the stories maybe we've heard a couple times before, or the ones that were sort of the more safer mainstream ones, because a huge part of what metal is rooted in authenticity. And part of being a metal fan is being that sort of connoisseur, of exploring the other various subgenres, going deeper into more of the underground. And we wanted to spotlight some of those, so fans especially can see that, okay, well, maybe the show is made by people who are fans. Like, for example, little show and tell, but like the band Death is a huge, they're a huge, like, kind of cult band, I would say. They have a kind of a cult fan base in metal, and that was something that it's a very tragic human story, of course, that a lot of people can relate to. I'm sure a lot of people have had family members, and just that awful, difficult fight with cancer. That's just such a traumatic thing. But for us, it was an opportunity to show, like, that bands like this don't get spotlighted that often on platforms like this, and so it was a great opportunity to do something like that. Hopefully, create some new fans of the music in the process. But then also, like, I remember I was flipping through my records when the show was first greenlit, and just coming across like this album by Hellion here, the Screams in the Night. And it's just such an amazing, underrated, underappreciated album. Female lead singer Anne Boleyn, she's got an incredible voice, but they never made it. Like, why didn't these guys make it? And of course, you just dig into the story a little bit, you start talking to some of the people involved in it, and there's definitely a story there to tell. So it was very cool that, like, our record collections took us on this kind of personal journey into getting some of these stories off the ground. But that was what was just very important to us, was the idea of just striking a balance between, okay, you maybe have heard of this story, you may have heard of Randy Rhoads. Obviously, everyone knows Ozzy and things like that. But then here's these stories that even the most seasoned of metal fan is this going to be something new for them too. So we wanted to create that balance. I mean, it's definitely something I've always been fascinated with. That time period in the '80s, the real satanic panic, moral crusade era of where metal was sort of perceived like it was going to be this evil thing that was going to corrupt your children. It was going to turn them delinquent or turn them into Satanists, and it was something that was very co-opted, by a lot of extreme, farther right Christian groups, and it was commodified as a way to kind of be weaponized as a thing that seemed, I'm sure, to them like low hanging fruit. Like, we can use this to our advantage to sort of spread our message and things like that. And that's what I find is very interesting about that episode in particular, because I do feel like it's very opportunistic, for, a lot of the people at the time. I mean, there was that perfect opening to see, well, I mean, because in this country with, freedom of speech, freedom of expression, it's like, for if a case like that somehow happened to be won or set a new precedent, it would change everything, in art and in music and all that stuff. And so to me, what was very revealing about that story in particular is because you've always kind of heard the Judas Priest story, side of that story. How, like, metal's on trial, rock and roll's on trial, art's on trial. But to me, what was equally fascinating was just sort of looking at the circumstances of, those two kids in terms of being fans of their music, and sort of like how, one of the parents and kind of took this idea and saw an opportunity to sort of, turn this into a court case and, and things like that. And it was a way for us to look at the more underappreciated aspects of that story. Well, yes, there's this whole cultural thing that's going on, but also what are the circumstances of what's happening in those households, and what were those kids going through, that are probably more socioeconomic situations in terms of their upbringing that informed this decision much, much more so than the music itself. The music might have been one of their only lifelines, ironically. So that was what was interesting to us, was to kind of tackle it from almost a different perspective. We have another series, Dark Side of the Ring, that I was mentioning, chronicles stories in the world of professional wrestling, and we tackle a lot of the same subject matters in that. And I feel like telling stories as honest and raw is that I find it's a way for people to also connect, and find relatable common ground stuff, with these kind of larger than life icons. It's this idea that we have all experienced loss and tragedy and grief and those types of things, and I think for many people it's a way to connect and relate more to these artists, where as many people might think that you can't, even because if you're not a fan of this stuff and you may have some conception of who these musicians are and the crazy lives that they lead, but then at the end of the day, you sort of find that they struggle and go through the same things that we go through. And I think for us, it's just so important that I think the thing that's the hardest about making our show is sort of convincing others that, our intention going into this is not what you normally would see, where, there are a lot of programs and TV shows and documentaries that would sort of sensationalize or exploit those very, wild stories, for the wrong reasons. And we want to try and find it for, the right reasons, which is obviously paying respect to the people that went through them, but also, like, I think there's things to learn, in terms of what these people have gone through. I know for a fact that, throughout the experience of doing this show and our other show, I've learned so much about the grieving process, that I never would have known without that, and being able to connect with people and see that they've gone through similar things that we have. So for us, it's very important to come at it from a very a very respectful and authentic and very, very emotional way, rather than ways that it's been portrayed previous. I think what a lot of like heavy metal fans can really relate to is this idea of, and I know I can too personally, because I definitely have felt that, growing up deep in the suburbs in the Midwest and being a weird kid who didn't fit in with all the other people, and didn't fit in with their interests and sports and stuff like that. It's like metal is, a lot of fans can relate to the idea of growing up alienated, constrained, pushed to the margins, and metal, that sort of like provocative, wild sort of energetic expression is a way to resist that conformity and to sort of reclaim identity. And I think for artists, it's not just like a sound that they're making. And I know for people like Wendy, it's a means for survival in a way. It's like that's the way she can articulate, her taking her traumas, her anger, her sort of exclusions, and her thoughts on society and everything, and channel that into purpose, empowerment, and things like that. So, I think, or in the case of Confess, which is even wilder, that they're sort of living under this regime of this sort of authoritarian government, who actively criminalizes this type of music and this type of expression. This is another need for them to go beyond just creating cool music. It's like a necessary thing. So yeah, I think it is a platform for that sort of raw, filtered expression, and for people to communicate much more meaningful messages that way. I think it's always been that way. Yes, it's true. Like in the 80s, like, you're singing about like dragons and monsters and things like that, of course, which I love too. But it also can be the vehicle to much deeper and much more meaningful things. And that's some of the things we wanted to highlight with the series. In terms of the, like the relatability with these subjects, I feel like, obviously, I hope metal fans watch the show and they feel like it was, very authentic, and it was made by fans for fans type of thing. I really hope that's their takeaway. But for the people who aren't as familiar with these bands and aren't fans of metal, I hope that they just see that these artists for who they really are, that they're human beings and they face the same struggles that we all do, and that they can, they have a deeper, richer understanding of the genre and the music, what makes it tick, what separates it from other genres, and things like that, and how, just because you have a wild and crazy onstage persona when you're in one of these bands, it doesn't necessarily mean that that's who you are or should be defined by. Like, you also are just a human being with all the same, complexities and flaws as the rest of us. And I think that's kind of what we want to see. That's what I would hope, that people, I just have a deeper, richer understanding of the music and the people who perform it.